Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to give everyone a couple more minutes to join. We might start in about a minute and a half. So sit tight, and I'm going to ask my colleagues just to go on mute until then, and we'll see you guys shortly. Hello, everyone. We're going to start in about 30 seconds, just letting folks trickle in here. All right, I think we're ready to get going. I wanted to give folks a few extra minutes to join us today, but I think we're ready to go. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody. I realize we have participants from all over the world. This was a pretty hot topic, I noticed. Was scanning the registration list before jumping on today's webinar. So definitely a neat topic. It's actually one that I've personally been pretty excited about hosting. I've been looking forward to this all month, frankly. I remember when I first kind of began in the MarTech and AdTech universe about 5 years ago. The topic of identity resolution was kind of new to me then, and it's fascinated me ever since, especially with the ever-changing regulatory and privacy environments. Seems like those are changing sometimes daily. So super excited to talk to you all today, and for our panelists, which I'll be introducing here in a second. But just to remind everybody, this is the Snowflake-Powered Identity Resolution webinar, hosted by MessageGears, featuring our good friends at Snowflake and at Truelty, the missing link for Snowflake connected applications. Just a couple logistical things. We are recording this, as always, and we'll be sharing the recording with those of you that attended and those of you that were unable to join us after the webinar. And also, today's a little bit unusual. We will be giving away 2 $50 Best Buy gift cards to those of you that are able to join and really stick with us through the end. The marketing team at MessageGears is monitoring who attended and whether you're with us to the very end. And so if you are, then you will be a candidate to get one of these goodies from our good friends at Best Buy. So this is our agenda for today. Kind of an action-packed content format here. We probably will eat up the full hour, although you never know. Sometimes some of us might move faster than others, but we did plan to kind of give you guys a lot to chew on over the next 55 minutes and hopefully carve out some time at the end for Q&A. So please do submit questions as they come to you through the chat interface in the GoToMeeting format. So you're gonna be hearing from myself in the beginning, and we'll be talking about kind of the modular CDP and customer engagement concept. Then we'll be transitioning to a more open panel discussion around identity resolution current states and trends. Then we'll be transitioning to what I'm super excited about, which is the Snowflake native first-party identity resolution offering from our good friends at Truelty. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have time at the end for Q&A. I am lucky to be joined by some great industry thought leaders and speakers today on our panel, Jared Hillam from Truelty and David Wells from Snowflake. And then I am Walter Rowland. I run our partnerships ecosystem at MessageGears and have been with the firm for just a little over 5 years. So that's the crew for today. Really, really excited to have such a great team joining us. So as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the agenda, we wanted to start out today by just discussing some high-level concepts that are emerging in the business-to-consumer MarTech and AdTech landscape. And it's this notion of Snowflake connected applications. And this diagram is meant to explain that a little bit. And it's sort of a fascinating trend that I've been a part of personally for the last 5 years. It's one that actually is exactly speaks to the origin story of MessageGears itself, the firm for whom I work. This was the MessageGears point of view when we started, which is more than 5 years ago, and has become more recognized really in the last 18 to 24 months, which has been pretty exciting for us. And the concept really is one around really reinventing what I would say is a 25-year-old construct, which is the traditional software as a service deployment model. And your typical software as a service deployment model, which you'll see on the left-hand side of your screen, this figure 1 traditional SaaS managed applications. This is really how organizations have been functioning, as I mentioned, for the last 20 plus years, where if you are a large brand with a lot of data about your customers, typically you have that data in some sort of internal system. And in the old days, that might have been like a Teradata or Netezza if you went back in time enough. Obviously now, more often than not, that's something like a Snowflake. But that's really what's happened is you've seen the rise of highly performant, highly elastic data clouds like Snowflake, and yet you still have this traditional software as a service deployment model where each SaaS vendor has their own data cloud that they're owning and managing. And so if you're a brand working with one of those SaaS providers, then you have to send them your data from your data environment, your data cloud, to the third-party SaaS provider's data cloud, which may be fine for some use cases, but may be painful and costly for others. And so what's emerged, as I mentioned, with MessageGears and other providers, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is this whole new model, which is figure 2, and this is the notion of connected apps. And so what you have here is where the data layer and the application layer have been separated from one another. And the brand controls and manages the data layer, and that is more often than not Snowflake. And then you've got an ecosystem of providers that just connect directly to it for their use cases. And I always like to say a rule of thumb for a true connected app is that the application itself will not work unless it is connected to the brand's data cloud. And that is certainly the case for MessageGears. Our platform will not function unless our customer brings their data cloud to the table, and then we just connect directly to that for our use cases. So there's no data mapping, there's no data syncing, there's no reverse ETL, there's no data friction. So it's a really fascinating trend that is live and in market today and well adopted by some very forward-thinking brands really across industries. So wanted to frame it for you all in terms of what we were talking about in terms of connected application, and then we'll get into more specific use cases with our friends at Truelty here in just a bit. It's always nice to see someone like Tarek over at Snowflake. He runs the Technology Alliances program at Snowflake, and so this is a quote from him that just really reinforces the point that I made earlier around what is a connected application. So you'll see here that he is reinforcing some of the points that I made earlier. This notion of solution providers like MessageGears process and store data on the brand's data cloud rather than our own. And then Tarek gets into or alludes to some of the significant business benefits that flow from that kind of deployment model. And I'll talk about some of those in just a bit. So hopefully everyone is maybe a little bit more informed in terms of what we mean by a connected application based on those two slides. And obviously happy to answer questions about those in the Q&A portion or after this webinar. So this next slide is really where we're getting into some meat here, and it's actually one of my favorite slides when I speak with partners and with prospects and customers as well. This lays out kind of a best of breed architecture, reference architecture for this notion of warehouse native, connected applications that are modular, composable might be another word for that, and they're solving in this case for what we would call CDP, so customer data platform, if those of you are not familiar with that acronym, and then customer engagement use cases. And this approach is one that is predicated on connected applications and soon native applications. So that is the next wave. And then we have data sharing in clean rooms and marketplaces. And if you go left to right in terms of this best of breed model, you've got these 6 pillars of CDP and customer engagement functional requirements, if you will. Starting from the left, you've got your data collection use cases where you're flowing data into the brand's data cloud, either in bulk format through traditional ETL processes, in this case represented by a Fivetran, but could be any number of providers that solve for that use case, really as a connected application. So they're flowing data into the brand's data cloud in a normalized format from a schema perspective. And then you've got the behavioral data providers like Snowplow, who is purely focused on behavioral data ingestion and transformation, and then RudderStack as well in the behavioral data ingestion side of the coin. So think of it like a Fivetran plus a Snowplow flowing data into the brand's data cloud. And then once it lands there, that's when you begin to see folks like Truelty doing their first party identity resolution, which we'll be talking about in just a bit, as well as others like DBT and Coalesce that some of you all may be familiar with as well. So this pillar is the first party identity and transformation and enrichment use cases. And then down below, you guys will notice the data sharing and data clean room icon and the marketplace of data providers, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And this is where Snowflake has some real differentiation in terms of making it very easy for brands to share their first party data in a secure PII compliant way with third party providers, like some of the brands on the bottom portion of this diagram, your Newstars, your Experience, your LiveRamps, your Infutours, your Equifaxes, and many, many more, such that you can enrich your first party data in a PII compliant way with some of these third party providers to fill in missing data points around any number of use cases. How long have you owned your home? Have you had an insurance claim against your home? Those kinds of use cases, and many, many more. So it's an interesting construct. I think it's important to recognize the first party swim lane along the top, and then the third party swim lane along the bottom. And then as you move further to the right, you've got additional use cases around machine learning, AI, and decisioning, which some brands do themselves, or some may tap into kind of out-of-the-box frameworks from connected application providers like Continual and Affinio. And then finally, you move into the right-hand side of this diagram, where admittedly, I'm a bit biased because I work for MessageGears. So, we are a connected application that solves for those final 3 pillars of functionality as a connected application. So our platform will not work unless we have a brand's Snowflake to connect to, and we solve for the segmentation and the native channel execution, which is email, push, and SMS. We are an ESP. And then finally, the third-party channel activation, which has infinite use cases, by the way. I did not put every single icon of every potential third-party endpoint for this third-party channel activation use case pillar, but you should think of this as your traditional ad tech endpoints like a Facebook or a Google or a Twitter or a Pinterest. It certainly could also be direct mail or call center or other MarTech solutions, you name it. There's really dozens and dozens of third-party endpoints that may come up when you want to send your first-party data to a third party to then activate. So I hope this helped frame it for everybody. And really today we're going to be digging now into Truelty a bit more, but I wanted to frame it up for you all. And before I get into the next chunk of our content, I did want to kind of educate everyone on the benefits of this kind of approach that we've seen from our customer base, which we share in common with Snowflake, certainly among others. So one of the, this bigger picture benefit to the warehouse native modular composable approach falls kind of into these four buckets. Certainly there's an agility aspect. If you have connected applications that are plugged directly into your Snowflake environment and you are a significant business to consumer brand, the agility of deployment and of launch and of ongoing adaptation and frankly even swapping out one connected app for another is vastly improved relative to alternate traditional managed application approaches. There's all kinds of efficiency benefits in terms of having data centralization and standardization in a brand's data cloud, such as Snowflake, and then all the automation and data sharing, that goes along with that. Enormous efficiency benefits relative to traditional, more legacy ways of handling some of these activities, especially around data sharing. That one is a very interesting one to watch what's happening in that space, data enrichment, data sharing. And then these next two, I think, are equally important, this notion of control. So if you're the chief information security officer at a large brand, you're very interested in keeping your customer data under lock and key, metaphorically, so to speak. So this notion of risk reduction, your data isn't floating around in multiple different third-party SaaS environments. You've got it locked down and controlled in your Snowflake environment as a brand is really, really important. And then additionally, with this composable and modular approach, you're not placing all your eggs in a single monolithic vendor basket. You've got Snowflake as your hub, and then you've got this best of breed ecosystem that are plugging into it or feeding it directly. So that's a much more modular and lower risk and flexible approach. And with all of that, does come cost reduction, not only in terms of sort of hard costs around licensing and ongoing support, but also softer costs around just operational efficiencies. So we've seen this, and we have Forrester reports and things to support these concepts. And finally, if you click down a layer and think about the benefits of Truelty and Snowflake and MessageGears all together, this gets a little bit more specific to our use cases around customer engagement, which is, dream and do is a story that we oftentimes tell ourselves. It's this notion of, as soon as your data is available in your Snowflake data cloud as a brand, then it's immediately available for segmentation and personalization at massive scale. You're getting first-party identity resolution basically in real time, so that you know that the three versions of Walter are in fact the same person and can activate and segment accordingly based on that transformation of 3 down to 1. You have the cross-channel. You're bringing marketing and enterprise data teams to work better together, and everyone is working faster and smarter because so much data friction has been removed from the equation. So that was a lot from me. And then the final thing I would mention is because I mentioned this in the agenda, well, who's doing this? Well, this is a quote from a joint customer of Snowflake and MessageGears that we like very much. Rakuten Rewards, Mark over there, has been an advocate of this kind of connected application approach for, I'm going to say, 6 years or more. He was using this terminology or these concepts before anyone else was, frankly. And he speaks to some of the benefits, right? It's the this notion of removing friction. There is no significant engineering effort or data movement, which basically just leaves them in a position to change how they function as a company, to be able to really dream and do and execute on any use case based on their data, which is readily at their fingertips in Snowflake, and then using MessageGears to just plug directly into that for the segmentation and cross-channel activation. Before I transition to this next topic, I did want to open it up to both of my panelists, since I did a heck of a lot of talking there, which was maybe not what I fully intended to do. Sorry, guys. Is there anything, David or Jared, that you would say from my previous 3 slides, and I'm happy to go back to any of them, that you would like to add to anything I just said?
No, I think it was very well said. I think, listen, Snowflake does work with some CDPs. Some of them actually use Snowflake as the foundational layer, or they have integrations. However, and in some instances, there are marketers that like CDPs in that it's a packaged solution that has various functionality. I think what you said and what we're seeing is that there is a huge trend towards this modular approach. And the reason is the flexibility and all the other sort of points that you mentioned, where marketers who are very sophisticated understand that they are able to partner with those partners that were on your slide, whether it's pulling data in, whether it's doing sort of the transformation of that data, whether it's partnering with a partner like MessageGears to segment and then activate, whether it's SMS or text or any of the paid media channels that you mentioned. And they prefer it in many instances. And the reason is, they have access to that data. The actual partners, the connected app ecosystem, are actually coming to Snowflake versus actually sending data out. That's something that we very much like at Snowflake, and we think our marketers like it too. And really, the truth is that the power of Snowflake as a repository or a place to securely park your first-party data and do analysis is directly tied to that connected app ecosystem of which Truelty and MessageGears are a part. So we're very grateful to have you as a partner that offer these types of functionality and services, where it's providing value to obviously your marketers that are leveraging it in the various ways, whether it's resolving an identity to an individual or it's segmenting and activating across an endpoint. And obviously it creates stickiness for you with that marketer. And then we at Snowflake, we love it, like for the reason that all of that work is happening within Snowflake. So I think it's incredibly well said.
And one other thing I'll add, I just got off a call earlier this week, yesterday, where we were talking with an organization, very large organization. The IT team was still deciding on where they were going to go in terms of technology choice, whether they were going to go Azure or AWS. GCP was on the kind of on the radar as well, but the team that we had been working with already had adopted Snowflake, so they were already making investments in moving there, and the stress of that whole decision does not impact that Snowflake decision whatsoever. They're able to move forward. They can go wherever they want to go. If the negotiations don't work out with AWS and they go to Azure or whatever, it frankly doesn't matter to this team. And I can't stress how much that matters when you're trying to make these big marketing investments, to be able to just be flexible enough that if the organization makes any big change there, you're not going to have to just dump all your assets after all that work has been done.
Amen. Great, well said. And I'm going to transition to our next topic and try to keep us somewhat on time. So Jared, you can have
sure
full 20+ minutes. But I did want to build on something that David said as well. Like this approach that we've been talking about, I'll be candid, from a MessageGears perspective, isn't necessarily for everyone. This notion of Snowflake as your hub and a connected app ecosystem plugging directly into that, I think that does presume a willingness to invest in data and analytics, leadership within a brand, or via a trusted advisor, and that can be hard. And not every brand is in a position to build out a strong data analytics leadership or invest in a trusted advisor to help them get there. So there is, I think, a middle market that may not buy into this connected application model, but I certainly think for brands that have millions of customers of their own, this is definitely a trend to keep an eye on, because the benefits are just pretty significant to this kind of approach. With that being said, I did want to transition, and David, this is, as I mentioned when we were prepping, I think I'm going to lay on you for a lot of this, but
Sure.
for those of you that didn't know this about David, he comes from the identity ecosystem, previous to his current role in the Snowflake marketplace ecosystem at Snowflake. So we're thrilled to have him because of that. And Jared's been banging around in the identity resolution space for a long time as well. So they know way more than I do. And I, as a relative layperson myself, these are some of the questions I had for you all. Like if you wouldn't mind, maybe David,
Sure.
verbally, just what is the difference between first and third party and deterministic and probabilistic, if you don't mind, maybe that first one.
Yeah, absolutely. So third-party graphs, right? Think about that as like a vendor that maintains their own online and or offline graph. So the way that typically works is they have a match network where they work with publishers, and individual consumers will authenticate with PII on that website, and then that identity provider will map that PII to various pseudo IDs or their own persistent ID. And usually that authentication comes with first name, last name, email, sometimes address or postal. And then on the offline side of the house, they usually have like a knowledge base or a repository of known information on the US population. So they know David Wells, lives at his address in Princeton, that he used to live in Brooklyn. Once upon a time, he lived in Chicago. And really the bridge between the two is email. So the offline includes postal, phone, email. The online includes, all these pseudo IDs mapped to a persistent ID and email. And so what they do is they have this online offline graph that's, married to a persistent ID, and they can run first party data through a pipe and resolve it to an individual or household. And listen, there are use cases that are very relevant, and in some cases it's very strong. If you want to take ad logs and map them to an individual or household and do some analysis in terms of third-party data, that's super powerful for things like measurement, or you want to activate across endpoints where some of those identity providers are integrated. Some of them are in the bid stream. That's powerful. I think the knock on identity providers that they've had, if any, is that sometimes there are issues with scale, right? If you're talking about matching on the offline world, you probably get pretty good match rates. But if you start matching on emails, your average individual has 5 to 7 emails. Maybe they have dwells75@gmail.com, and I sit in the CRM of some large marketer that wants to onboard. Or maybe they don't have dwells4@aol.com, which was like my email address maybe 20 odd years ago. And I sit in the CRM of some large marketer, and they're not able to onboard or make that match. And so, as marketers get more and more sophisticated, they're really pushing those identity providers to have the greatest scale with onboarding their first party data for the purposes of activation, or taking in ad logs and resolving those IDs to a persistent ID to, perform attribution or measurement. And like the same side in terms of onboarding and activating, there are some issues sometimes with resolving cookies and IPs and maids to a persistent ID. It's really hard work to maintain online and offline graphs, and some of them do a really good job of it. However, sometimes there are issues with scale. And then the other thing I would say is it's very expensive sometimes. If you're a large marketer and you're resolving millions and millions of records, and you're constantly updating those records, it's a lot of processing, and it's a significant cost. First party graphs, right, are very different, right? Like in the case of Truelty, which we see tremendous value in their solution as it relates to Snowflake, is this idea that I'm going to develop my own first party graph with a persistent Truelty ID that sits alongside the PII I have on David Wells that includes his various emails, his physical address, his phone, and then I'm going to maintain a relationship with him through that mapping that I've created. And where that's incredibly valuable as it relates to, say, like an activation or an integration platform like MessageGears, is like I can then go send him an SMS text, and I know, hey, if I'm an apparel brand, I need to message him on the weekends. He's more receptive to that type of messaging and perform that type of analysis. Or I need to hit him like anywhere from like 2 to 5 times a month, and it's going to be a combination of emails, and it's going to be a combination of text, and then maybe I sort of send that data to like a social channel or a DSP where I'm going to activate him. And what's great is like the partnership that we're talking about with first party graphs and Truelty, and the way that they work with connected apps like MessageGears, is that you're getting to a point where you're managing your relationship with consumers at an individual level, right? So that first party data is sitting alongside that Truelty ID, and you're sort of getting to know that customer. You're not just trying to, run campaigns to move product. And I think that's a huge shift that we're seeing in marketing, as more and more partners, with the impending deprecation of third-party cookies and other types of pseudo IDs, is like these marketers who are super smart are like, hey, I'm not just collecting first-party data, I'm using that as a means to actually maintain a relationship with the consumer, where I'm respecting their privacy and I'm respecting how they want, me to message them. And the thing is I think if you respect that and you do it and you use data to sort of message them in the appropriate way, consumers appreciate that. Right? So like I was talking to a woman named Jessica Liu, who I think works at Forrester. So she talked about this idea of, there once upon a time, there was this idea of people-based marketing, or like one-to-one marketing. And she started talking about this idea of one-to-moment marketing, which is, it's not enough to message David like with a text or an email or a display ad, but it's messaging him at the appropriate time. So, between the hours of 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. Monday through Friday, he's working. Like if you're that apparel marketer, like you probably are not going to get a captive audience there. How do you use data, and you use first party identity as well as a platform like MessageGears to understand this is when he wants us to communicate with him, and this is the kind of content that he wants communicated to him. Let's leverage that to our ability, so that we're in good standing with David, and we can sort of maintain that and grow that relationship. That helps. And in terms, yeah, go ahead, Jared. Sorry.
No, I was just saying I love it. That was me, David. But yeah,
Okay.
you're giving us a lot to chew on there. Keep going.
Yeah. The one thing I would say is just about deterministic versus probabilistic, right? So comes down to, just think of it as, I've determined there's a connection between this device and this individual. So are people authenticating and saying, hey, here's David, he's authenticating on a website, he's using his mobile phone, it's tied to this mobile ad ID, and then all of that made, and then other pseudonymous IDs are deterministically matched to a persistent identifier, so that we know that there's a deterministic match where we can accurately either target or resolve like ad exposures to David. And we've determined that that's him, that represents him. And the really good ID partners are doing that not in a single instance, they're doing that in multiple instances. They need like 3 to 5 events of authentication. And like maybe they have a different scoring model when there's only 2 to 4. And then maybe when they, there is no authentication, or there's one or a seldom instance of authentication, they're just like, we can't say deterministically that David, is tied to this device, or that this is actually David. And I think what's great is like there's some identity partners that solely play in the deterministic space, and like they have really good accuracy, and the insights are, on point, right? Because if you don't have a deterministic match, or you don't have a high degree of accuracy of that match, then who's to say that your findings, your analytics are going to be accurate? And that sort of devalues the proposition. Now, sometimes there are issues with scale, and you want to infer or say there's a high probability of a match. So things like, is a device sniffing a Wi-Fi, and can we infer that there's a match there, and that device actually is associated with that address, and that address is tied to David. Sometimes that partners that want to have greater scale for things like targeting, they might use probabilistic matches because it's worth it in terms of the scale. So that's kind of the two differences. And, depending on your application, sometimes there's applications of probabilistic matching with the caveat that you sort of have to live with a plus or minus on the margin of error.
So it's really a business decision for the brand.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Depending on the use case.
Yeah.
Well, super. I want to make sure that, Jared, you've got time to tell us the Truelty story because it's such a powerful one. So I'm going to use this third bullet. What is the future, to transition to you? And I'm literally about to do so. I just want to tee it up and say that, let me see if I can figure out how to do this. Bear with me, audience. I want to say that the future, which Jared will talk to us about, is one where it's potentially hybrid approaches. In other words, this notion of step one, tackle your first party deterministic identity resolution natively as a connected or native app in Snowflake, and then from there, make a business decision in terms of what else you want to do. And I know, Jared, you're going to tell us that story. So I'm going to hand it over to David. Thank you so much. And and by the way, we're coming back for Q&A. You'll hear from all three of us, but mostly from the smart people, David and Jared, and less so from me. But tell us the Truelty story, Jared. Really excited.
So let me just do so by kind of talking to third party for just a second, and then I'll transition that to where Truelty lives. So in a third party relationship, when you're taking and deduplicating records, and that's really the core function that we're going to be talking about, is just this deduplication process. And third party resolution is great in that you can send them all these records, and then they'll send you sort of, hey, here's all the records that are duplicates, and that kind of information, and even enrich the record. The challenge obviously is, because it's a third party and we're going to send them all of our data, the legal agreements are not casual, right? There's a lot going on in these agreements. One of my good friends that works in the marketing space, he said his last one that he signed on these took a year to sign for their legal team, right? So there's a lot going on in these agreements. And usually the snapshots are daily. So a 24-hour run is usually the refresh time for this. And usually the pricing is set at a per record rate, right? So we're going to charge you on a per record basis. So if you're Home Depot, you're going to be spending a lot of money on this because you obviously have a lot of customer records, and it ends up becoming a really large number, like something that could stop the heart of the finance executives. And where I would say that third party really does make a lot of sense is in the concept of enrichment. They've spent a lot of time creating these graphs that are very, very valuable. They have a lot of really useful data that you might not be capturing. So I absolutely feel that acquiring the data out of those graphs is worthwhile, but asking those graph vendors to deduplicate your data is simply something that can be done locally inside of a Snowflake instance. Your Snowflake instance has the compute power to do that. And that's really what Truelty is. It is a deduplication engine that lives inside of your Snowflake instance. It is an engine that generates code, and it'll literally create an ID to identify the clusters of duplicate records. So you could see this example. This is the same person. And this record may have been sourced from Salesforce and Marketo and maybe a call center and a bunch of other things. As long as that data is all residing in Snowflake, we can run Truelty against that, and it will produce this cluster ID to identify where these duplicates live, so that you can at least have that checkbox marked. So as you're streaming data in, you can continuously keep that identity refreshed. So I'm not going to go through the history here, but just be aware that this is not something we just woke up and decided to do. It's something that has several deployments that have executed on Snowflake to resolve identity with brands that are household brands and you would know. We launched at Snowflake Summit this summer. And so just talking about it specifically, Truelty is what I like to call code as a service. So our code is literally being executed on your Snowflake instance locally. We are, driving headfirst into the embedded program of Snowflake as well. So at some day in time, you'll be able to just use our app as like directly inside of Snowflake as if it was an iPhone app. Today, it's a Python application built for Snowflake. And it has a control plane layer, right? So there's a control plane where you can go in and identify the tables that you have, as well as identify the columns. And it literally executes all of the queries right on top of Snowflake, okay, your Snowflake instance. So because we're only looking at operational metadata for the control plane, which I can show to you, because of that, we're not really having to see the data itself. Thus, it's a zero trust model. You don't have to trust that we're going to behave with your data, or that we're not, you don't have to worry about that, because we never see the data. All we see is metadata of the columns, and we use Snowflake's native capabilities for profiling the data so that we can actually get a correct view on whether it's a phone number or an email address or what have you. Additionally, because we do generate a lot of queries, right? This is all gonna be executing locally on your Snowflake instance. So a lot of queries are gonna get fired off. And for that reason, we create a little segregated zone inside of your Snowflake instance so that it's not mingled with your everyday BI queries. And in the end, what we produce is a few tables, but the core point of these tables, and I'm gonna escape out of here and increase the size of this so that you can see the numbers more easier. Okay, here we go. So basically, you've got a cluster key. The cluster key repeats for every time we see duplicates, and you see these are the unique source IDs. So this is just a join on a table that you're doing after this runs, right? So then it identifies, here's all the duplicates, and here are the locations of those actual tables themselves, so that those unique record IDs can be identified as duplicates. All right, so we'll talk just briefly how it works. I won't go too deep into this. Basically, we create this Truelty ID. And obviously the records don't appear this way to us when you first run it. It's pretty much random records, a lot of records of different people, but we assigned a Truelty ID to all these people. And remember, they're coming from different applications. We then take and we automatically generate the code to create tables out of each of these columns with a respective score for each of them. And then we create exact pairs, because that's a very fast processing routine inside of Snowflake. We identify exact pairs, and then we start doing scoring of pairs and coupling. And we start doing what we call chaining, right? So we're starting to chain pairs, and we take the highest scores first and chain those pairs together where they are closest to their equals. And then we start doing what's called deep chaining, which is taking the more fuzzy attributes and chaining those together as they fit the stronger chains. So the deep chaining does get into a little more of the deep compute inside of Snowflake to conduct. And I like the most extreme example of this, how we've built this, is if you've ever watched Tesla's AI Day, it's a really fun watch, but they have this massive supercomputer that comes up with this model, and the model actually goes through all this iteration, and then they take that model and load it onto the dumb car, right? In a lot of ways, that's what's happening here. We've done a lot of work in creating a model that will deal with identity resolution. We're taking that model, loading it as code on your Snowflake instance. So as you're executing that code, it will actually go through and and run all of these things. So it'll actually run the identity resolution. 90% of the compute that we run on Snowflake happens with extra smalls. That sometimes takes the sales out of a lot of, takes the wind out of a lot of the sales of reps from Snowflake. But what I will say is that the nice part is that you can run this intraday. It's no longer this 24-hour model, right? You don't have to just run it once and feel like you got to wait for 24 hours. You know, if you got billions of records, you probably will finish processing in about 15 minutes. And so you could run it every 15 minutes. It's highly efficient, right? So you could run it every 15 minutes all day long, because frankly, your data is streaming in anyway, right? So to have us to live in a scenario where you would just only get resolution after 24 hours when all your data is streaming intraday, it's a little tough to swallow. But here, what you can do is continuously stream and continuously resolve duplication of records. We use a technique called hyperpacking that, you know, if you're a geek, you'll get something out of this, but we pack 3 million records for every micropartition, which is just incredible. I mean, it's a lot of records that we're packing in, and it's because our engine controls all those queries. And we asynchronously process, meaning we could take what would be like 35 minutes of queries and turn it into 5 minutes of queries. And it's all dynamic. So the compute allocation is dynamic. The processing is all dynamically defined with the engine. And it takes us about 6 to 9 seconds to process 1 million records, which is very, very fast for this world. And our licensing model, this is one of the great points. It's a flat licensing model. You pay a single fee per year, and the only variable fee you're paying for is the Snowflake compute. So we're not charging on a per record basis. That makes it really hard to swallow the concept of, you know, having to pay millions of dollars to do this thing. It's a very, very affordable option. So
and to your point, since it's asynchronous processing, the Snowflake compute is really marginal because it's happening so
very
fast.
Marginal.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the variable part on the Snowflake side, it's very contained. I mean, I haven't seen a lot of applications run this efficiently. I mean, we're definitely using the more propeller head features inside of Snowflake to make this as efficient as possible. How are we doing on time? Would I have time to go show it to everybody? All right. So let's dive in. So what you get in the control plane is a portal with a dashboard to start. It'll kind of tell you what your last run was, how many records got processed, how long it took, how many credits it took. And then when you go to your sources, you know, one of the base assumptions, obviously, that we have is that you have loaded all your data into Snowflake, right? So if you don't have that box checked, you'll need to go do that. And you know, there's plenty of vendors out there like Fivetran and others that make it fairly easy to just feed this data in and replicate the data from these application systems. Once it's in, then you'll be presented with that table as an option for you to source from. You can name them so that if you need business users to go in here and toy with this, they'll have the ability to go see what the tables represent. And then a lot of customers will have hundreds of tables inside of Snowflake, not just a few. So you can mark them as active or inactive. So if you have many tables, or maybe you want to do a certain segment and another certain segment, and you want to have sort of 2 separate segments, you can do that of matching. And then this is really where you get into the meat, where you can identify what the columns are. Now we do this automatically using a native Snowflake feature called data profiling. So Snowflake has this ability to tell us, you know, whether it's a phone number, whether it's a social security number, whether it's, you know, whatever it is. This is why we don't actually have to read your data. We just find out what the metadata is, and then you go through a validation step to make sure that we got it right. Okay, so we have our own base. Mappings, so US city, but there's a whole bunch of other ones that are on the base. And then you can also indicate whether it's a validated field. For example, you might go through a validation process in your emails where the person registers and you send them an email to validate that it's real. In that case, you can tick that, hey, this is a validated field, and then it'll go ahead and execute that. So let me what I'm going to do is just show you what a run looks like. I'm just going to grab here a session ID. Let's go into Snowflake.
And Jared, inevitably we get the question sometimes like, okay, well, what if I don't have first-party data? Well, there are tools that live on Snowflake that will help you populate first-party data. And also we've seen marketers actually move towards an instance where they'll license a file that represents the US population over the age 18 that is kind of a virtual CRM, and then they can sort of use this technology to sort of
that's exactly right.
Resolve additional, data to that file.
So what I'm showing here, this is just a single session ID, and this is a run. So this is a run and with all of its events. So you can see, I mean, there's a lot of little queries happening here, but they're all running as asynchronous queries, and you can see that based on the start and end times, they're almost identical in a lot of cases, because we're actually in async, we can run all of these queries in parallel. And so like I mentioned, we're taking that model that we've created that generates all these queries, and that's on your Snowflake instance that executes all this at once. This is partially, again, the reason why this is not for everybody in your organization to see. This is sort of a role that has its own capacity. So so you can see most of these are run on extra smalls. And then I think in this run, we do scale to a large, I think for some of the remaining pairing events. Yeah, so we're scaling up to a large here. And then we finish the job. So the Truelty environment is really designed for Snowflake to execute and in the end result of this is just basically a table, right? So it's a table, it's got Truelty IDs, and then you've got your repeating source IDs, and that's a table you can join to. The nice part about that is it could be used for anything. I mean, when I was in analytics, doing analytics work, it was incredibly annoying to me that I couldn't do like a regional customer report because I couldn't identify the unique customer. I didn't know I couldn't tell people how many customers we had in an area because I didn't know how many unique customers we had. There's lots of different other use cases, like another really simple use case is unsubscribes, and you need to deal with GDPR and CCPA. If someone unsubscribes and you need to go find this person in all these other locations, guess what? You now have a place to go do that. So that's I'm a little over time, but that gives you kind of an idea of what Truelty is.
And to tie it back to MessageGears, right? If you have all of that data in a table and you're running SMS, email, whatever, you can then map all of those open rates, interaction rates to that table. So it's like, hey, David, we sent him a text on Saturday at 12 o'clock. He opened it, he landed on our webpage, he made a purchase.
Yep.
That's the time to talk to him. That's when he's in his moment where he's a captive audience. That's incredibly powerful to marketers, and I think that speaks to the modularity of Snowflake as a.
Yeah, there's a ton of use cases. Another interesting one that I found out about just a little while back is, you can't de-anonymize users. That's against the rules. You can't do that. But people do sign up and become loyalty members themselves, and the history of their purchases, once they've unmasked themselves, can be attributed to that user. And that's another really powerful concept, is just being able to acquire history. As long as you're gathering some elements that are unique to that anonymized user, when they de-anonymize themselves, you've got a rich history. I mean, my wife and I have been going to the same theater for like 5 years, and I just barely signed up for their loyalty program. They think I'm like, it's the first time I've gone to their theater. So.
Guys, we have just an enormous number of questions, and we're not going to get through them all in 5 minutes. I think I'd love to summarize a theme and make sure that I got it right. if I could, and this is actually directly related to one of the questions, which is very, very nice of that person who asked this question. But the question basically is, so what you're saying is I should do my own first-party deterministic within my own Snowflake and then tap into third parties for help with enrichment or even probabilistic matching.
Yeah, because think about it. If you're going to send, so let's just say that, I mean, it's pretty common, somewhere between 20 to 50% of your records are duplicates in most enterprises. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're duplicates, I'm going to pay a per record fee to toss over the fence 50% of waste, essentially, to that vendor that resolves or that enriches my records. I mean, that's the value, is the enrichment that they provide. The deduplication, there's no reason we should be sending it to that vendor if we can deal with it cheaply locally. If we can deal with that on a very cheap basis locally, then what I can send to the vendor is really the stuff I care about, which is enrichment. I want you to give back to me their Facebook IDs, and I want you to get back to me all the other information that's relevant to that person that could help me in my business. But to do duplicates when you can do it locally as cheap as possible, especially as cheap as we're doing it, there's no other way that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think just that right there is a massive paradigm shift, right? Like clean up your own data, first party, and then enrich with third party using ideally, the marketplace and data clean room. I mean, that is a very frictionless way to do it.
Yes.
For those.
Thank you, Walter.
Well, it's just, you're welcome. I mean, we see it with our joint customers. I mean, and one of the questions here was, well, what's that enrichment really all about? It's basically like, I have mailing address, but I don't have how long you've owned the home, or I have mailing address, but I don't know.
It's the additional information.
Yeah, insurance claims against the home. Is it brick or is it, hardy board? Like those kinds of data points that's where you tap into third parties to get that kind of additional, let's call it offline data. That's a very common third party enrichment.
I think that's right. It could be transactions from a third party. It could be offline data, and then you can use that and other tools to create, ML models, right? So that's
this is really the ground floor, is what I call it. Truelty is really sort of ground floor deduplication, and it has a lot of applications in a lot of different areas. We're not trying to boil the ocean. We're not trying to do enrichment. We're not trying to do these other things. We're really just, hey, I've got duplicate records. Let me fix that problem. And I don't have to send my data to a third party to fix that problem. We can deal with that locally. Essentially, the code can be executed locally to do that because we have this unlimited compute capacity inside of Snowflake. Right? There's no reason I should have to send these records to a third party or go through some extensive contracting process to deal with that specific issue.
Bingo. That right there is just disruptive, transformational stuff. Hey, here's a softball for you, Jared. In the 1 minute we have left, does Truelty? So identity resolution is a child of entity resolution in general. So this one is, does Truelty work for companies, entities? I guess. So go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. So Truelty in our foray and how we've put it in our GUI is for customer, right? Now, just to get into the weeds a little bit, the application speaks to a very small set of tables inside of Snowflake. Okay, we're literally writing to some tables in Snowflake. The actual Python that executes reads those tables and then executes everything locally. So again, we never see any data. The only data we're given access to are these control tables inside the application. Now, what that means though, if I wanted to add some regular expressions to represent non-customer related entities, I could create those. These are just data. It's just part of the data set. Our GUI, the way we've designed our GUI is for customer, but that does not preclude you from adding regular expressions for products, for financial instruments, for whatever you wanted to add as a regular expression, you can put those in there. The Python application doesn't know, whether that came from the GUI or it's the tables that it's going to obey. So when it goes to execute, it will go ahead and execute on entities as well. In a future release, we're going to have a global settings where you can add entities and things like that beyond the identity. You can have actually entities themselves.
Got it. Yeah, I figured just the general entity resolution in Snowflake topic. Give Jared a shout. Obviously, identity resolutions, they're bread and butter, but other entities, I'm sure they have a lot of subject matter expertise. Okay,
and I'd
guys.
love to answer all of these questions. Maybe we could do a chat later and I'll answer them all.
Yeah, there's some great ones in here. I think I will commit as MessageGears to get these to you, Jared.
Yeah.
Since a lot of them are handled for you specifically. So
sure.
And those of you that asked the questions that did not have them answered, please know that we will enable Jared to respond to you directly for those questions. They were really good ones. We appreciate it. I'm going to thank the attendees for the extra time. I'm going to thank David and Jared. I could talk to you guys for hours on this topic. I meant what I said at the beginning of the call. This ecosystem of identity, third party, first party, deterministic, probabilistic, offline, online, regulatory, and privacy, changing landscapes is a fascinating ecosystem. And it also is one that is being transformed, frankly, by technology such as Snowflake, and really more importantly, potentially, the data clean room and data sharing stuff that's happening. So if you bring all that together, the power of the compute, the native first party approaches that Jared's been talking about that are just frankly going to save you a lot of money, let alone drive better customer experiences in 15-minute increments, which is what MessageGears cares about together with everyone on the phone and our customers. You bring all that together, first party resolution natively in Snowflake, and then enrich it and activate it. I mean, that is fascinating and radically transformative. So thank you guys for helping educate not only me, but those of you that were able to join today. And I really look forward to doing more stuff like this with you guys in the future.
Likewise. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you all.
All right, signing off.
Thanks a million.